Welcome to a special edition of In Conversation with Winterflood. I'm Verity Viola-Heir, and today we are joined by Joe Winkley, Head of Corporate Services, and Sophia Bechev, Head of RAP Execution from Winterflood, a division of Marex. For decades, participation in high-profile IPOs has been largely available to institutional investors only, with retail investors often gaining access only after a company commences trading. However, advances in market infrastructure and distribution technologies are transforming that model, creating new opportunities for individual investors to participate in primary market offerings alongside institutions. Joe Winkley, SpaceX was a much anticipated IPO. Why is the possibility of retail inclusion generated so much attention?
Well, I think this is a really interesting transaction for a number of reasons. We talk about sort of IPOs and retail inclusion, and what we've seen historically has been that if you did a UK IPO, for example, you might include UK retail investors, and a number of US IPOs would include US retail investors. What was interesting about SpaceX is the first time that anyone has attempted to do a global retail offer. So what do we mean by that? Which is that retail investors across a wide range of jurisdictions, including Australia, Japan, US, UK, and Europe, were all allowed to participate. And also, what's really interesting is the company went out from the outset and said that their aim was to get at least 20% of shares in retail hands. That's incredibly unusual. So this is a really groundbreaking transaction in that regard. We don't normally see retail having that big a seat at the table, and certainly not on an IPO of this scale.
Fantastic. And before we discuss access, could you explain what retail inclusion in an IPO is and why it matters?
So retail inclusion in IPO, what are we talking about? What we are really talking about is retail investors like you and me being able to access IPOs on exactly the same terms as institutional investors. So typically, when you do an IPO, you will either have a price range where it prices within the range, or interesting in the case of SpaceX, you had a fixed price offer at $135. Now, in the past, if retail was not included, that price would have only been available to institutional investors and retail would have been excluded. What we're seeing here is that retail investors, they had the opportunity and were able to participate at exactly the same price as institutions. As it turned out on day one, the price went up about 20%. So you can see why there are certain advantages in being able to access day one IPOs in a way that retail has historically not always had that opportunity.
Fantastic. And traditionally, retail investors have had limited access to IPO allocations. So, what's changing in the market today?
I think what we're seeing, and again, this is a change which has been coming for a while. So this is not a change which is specific to SpaceX, but I think it is indicative of the way that the market has been going, which is that companies are becoming more and more aware of the importance and the power of retail investors. In this case, globally, the number reported from retail alone was over 100 billion of demand. That is an enormous investor base to be able to go after. So I think what we're seeing is two things. I think we're seeing a recognition of the importance of retail. Alongside, I think in some cases, we're seeing a potential decline in the accessibility of institutional funds. That wasn't the case in SpaceX. It was, I think, we again reported 3 to 4 times oversubscribed on the institutional basis. But I think there has been historically I think a lack of recognition of the value of retail investors and what they can bring, not only in terms of actual levels of demand, but also in terms of secondary market liquidity. So I think we are seeing a real shift in perception. And we're seeing it in the UK. There's been a lot of push to get retail investors included in a number of different transactions, and that is coming both from the regulator and it's also coming from the government. But clearly, there is now an understanding that actually the global retail investor base could be really important on transactions going forwards.
Wonderful. No, that's really interesting. And I think it really shows kind of the position of Winterflood Retail Access Platform. I mean, Sophia, could you tell me a little bit more about Winterflood Retail Access Platform, or RAP as it's known? Because I know Winterflood's been at the forefront of retail participation in capital markets. So for listeners who may not be familiar, it'd be great to get a bit of background on that.
Brilliant. Thanks, Verity. So, the Winterflood Retail Access Platform was established in 2023. And one of the main sort of drivers for that was really that we work incredibly closely with intermediaries in the UK on behalf of underlying retail investors in the secondary market. So we're a main sort of trading house for that purpose. And we wanted to understand how we could actually support in the primary market as well as the secondary. And that's where the Winterflood Retail Access Platform was kind of born. The way it works is we connect issuers, working very closely with their advisors, their brokers, banks, and lawyers, with underlying retail investors through intermediaries here in the UK. So the likes of Hargreaves Lansdown, Interactive Investor, and AJ Bell. We've built our own platform using our own proprietary technology, which we're very proud of at Winterflood, that allows us to aggregate those orders and then put them into the main book on behalf of the issuer. On the other side, we also then manage settlement fully in-house as well. So it's a real end-to-end solution for us.
Fantastic. That's brilliant. And one of the things as well that's kind of come up in conversation, I think, as part of this transaction is talking about the POP regime or what a POP operator is. Joe, would you be able to kind of tell us exactly what a POP operator is?
Yeah, absolutely. So POP is an acronym. It is the Public Offer Platform Regime. And what this means in practice is that you can bring an IPO or a fundraising to the UK market without having to create an entire UK FCA vetted prospectus. So in this case, in the case of SpaceX, there are effectively two documents that investors could use to make an investment decision. The first was the US prospectus, which was created by the company and filed in the US with the SEC. But alongside that, the POP regime required us to diligence the company. So we got to attend the bank's due diligence session. So we had to do our own independent diligence on the company to make sure that we could verify a number of the statements that they made. But also we had to create our own document, which is a slightly different document to the prospectus. It's a document that is aimed more at UK retail investors. So it's a kind of slimmed down version of the prospectus. And the intention there was to create something which was understandable for UK retail. And that is a regulatory obligation that we have under the POP regime. So it is I think the way I would describe it is an easier way for international IPOs to be brought to the UK market without needing to jump through a whole load of red tape. So that's really the essence of the POP regime.
Fantastic. And how can Winterford support issuers and advisors as a POP operator?
So I think what is interesting about SpaceX is that it is the first company to use the POP regime to support an international IPO. And I think the opportunity here is that there may well be others that look at what SpaceX has done, not just in the context of the POP regime, but in the context of doing global retail offers and the level of demand that's there. And if they start seeing this as a template or a precedent for future transactions, then there is a huge opportunity for us to work with future issuers, future IPOs, and to use exactly the same approach we took with SpaceX, which is to bring these kind of really interesting, exciting transactions to UK retail investors.
So, Joe, looking specifically at SpaceX, what makes this a particularly interesting case study for retail inclusion?
Well, I think that what I would say about SpaceX is that it's an entirely unique transaction. So this is the biggest IPO in history. It is the first time that a global retail offer has ever been undertaken. And I think the one thing that I would say is that the size and the profile of the transaction has really galvanized retail interest. And so, from our perspective, we saw a level of retail demand that we haven't seen since Royal Mail. There was roughly 1 billion of retail demand, that's the reported number, and over 100,000 individual investors looking to participate in the IPO. These are kind of numbers we haven't seen for a long, long time. So, I think the really interesting takeaway from our perspective is that there is, when you have the right story and it's presented in the right way, there is significant retail demand that can be accessed. And I think the looking forwards, it's all about how do you tap into that? How do you tap into that retail demand and bring that into future IPOs?
So, Sophia, what role did Winterflood and Marex play in providing access to UK retail investors?
So, thinking about this probably from the lens of a retail investor and what you would have seen in relation to this transaction from a Marex point of view, we created our POP website, which sort of operated as a source of information for investors to understand a little bit more about our role, but also how to participate. So, we listed different intermediaries that were taking part in the offer and that were able to take orders from investors, and then you could go through to their website and then submit your demand if you did want to take part in the offer. Behind the scenes, we aggregated all of the demand from those intermediaries. So, for example, if you're an investor and you put an order in via Hargreaves Lansdown, for example, ultimately your order would have fed through into WRAP. We would have aggregated all of that demand, and that would have gone into the main SpaceX book.
And Sophia, what role did Winterflood and Marex play in providing access to UK retail investors?
So, one of the important factors of being a POP operator was that we had to create a POP website. And on that website, we listed key information in relation to the company. We housed important documentation. So, Joe spoke about the prospectus, but also the disclosure summary that Marex had to create in relation to the offer. Also, things like the information leaflet. So it housed information that investors could use, but also importantly, it listed how investors could participate. So the list of intermediaries that we worked with for this transaction, if you're an investor and you visited our website, you would be able to see a list of those and then ultimately go to the broker that you use to then be able to submit your demand in the offer. What WRAP then did in the background is that those intermediaries would submit their demand into us. That order would ultimately feed its way through to us via the WRAP platform. We would aggregate all of the retail demand across the UK, and we would then submit that into the main SpaceX book.
And I think following on from that, what is the benefit of using WRAP as a platform to access retail investors?
I think from the point of view of the issuer, it is hopefully a very straightforward process for them because the onus is really on us to work very closely with the intermediaries to ensure that the right documentation is available across the market, that kind of consistency and clarity of information, and also acting as the main aggregator point for the various intermediaries. That then means that from the issuer's point of view and from the bank's point of view, we are able to kind of deal with the UK retail market and pass that single order through to them.
One of the things that was actually quite impressive about this transaction was that the way that it worked, the company sets the allocation parameters. In this case, it was you had a minimum fill, and then over that you got scaled back, and then there was a maximum fill. And we could basically take that, plug that in, and then allocate 120,000 different accounts.
Mhm.
And it took less than 30 seconds.
And what happens next?
So once the demand has been submitted into the main book, we would then understand the allocation parameters available for UK retail. So in this instance, allocation was done by way of a minimum fill, so a base number of shares. There was then scale back thereafter with a maximum cap on the number of shares that any one investor could have. We would then submit the order into the main book, and then we are then provided with an allocation policy. So in this instance, the allocation policy was everyone received a minimum number of shares. There was then scale back thereafter with a maximum cap. All investors were treated the same. And what we can do in WRAP is we can actually apply those allocations directly in the system in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing that you know what you asked earlier, sort of what is the advantage of RAP? This is something which is it sounds very simple, but is actually incredibly complicated. To make sure that you are applying a very consistent allocation policy, you are treating every single investor the same. In this instance, we had nearly 120,000 entries in there. And from a technology perspective, I mean, the great thing is it worked absolutely perfectly. As Sophia said, the allocations were done absolutely spot on and they were done in seconds. And that's something which, from a company's perspective, having that confidence in the system to actually deliver that is really important.
Fantastic. So, what would a transaction of this scale mean for Winterflood and the evolution of the WRAP platform?
A transaction of this scale, what that really means for Winterflood is it demonstrates the ability for us to work at scale, and I think that's very important. We can deal with incredibly high volumes. We can deal with several 100,000 investors on a line-by-line basis. These are really important things that large issuers who are looking at similar types of transactions would believe are very important parts for us to be able to operate effectively. I think it also demonstrates the fact that we are able to support very large companies, but also very small companies. And we really believe in the importance of retail being able to access all different types of transactions. But I think it really is that point around volumes and our ability to operate at scale that is very key here.
And does this represent a step change in how companies think about engaging retail investors?
I think it does, yeah, because I think historically some issuers may shy away from including retail because they believe it's too difficult or too complex, or they just quite possibly sort of couldn't fit it in with the timings of their transaction. I think what we're really seeing here actually, and our ability to act as a pop operator, really means that we're able to take we are really able to simplify that process for issuers and work very closely with them to be able to offer into the UK market, which is very important for retail investors.
Was the SpaceX transaction different to a normal wrap transaction?
Yes, it was very different for a number of reasons, and the first one was comes back to the point we made about acting as a pop operator. When the transaction started, we actually had to work very closely with the FCA in order to satisfy them that we could act as a pop operator. And that was a very rigorous and detailed process that we had to go through. Typically, I think it would take quite a long time to get through that. We managed to do it in about 2 months. So that was a huge amount of work. In total, from the point at which we first found out about the transaction to the completion of it, it was about 3 months. So in many ways, that was a very accelerated timeline, partly on the regulatory side, but also coming back to what I was talking about in relation to POP. We had to diligence the company. We had to get involved in diligence sessions. We had to draft an entire disclosure summary as a regulated document. And Sophia had to work very closely with the platforms to bring them up to speed. None of them had ever done a US IPO before. There were certain rules around that that was really important to educate the platforms on. So that was a much longer process. I think were we to do another POP transaction, we've learned a huge amount. We could probably do it more quickly. But it does feel that we're talking about a few months, whereas other wrap transactions we can execute in a matter of a few days.
So, Joe, Sophia mentioned timing. What made the SpaceX IPO differ from a normal wrap transaction?
So with a normal wrap transaction, we can move quite quickly. So in some cases, we can go live within a matter of days, maybe weeks. In the case of SpaceX, it was from the moment we were first approached about the opportunity to the close of the transaction, it was about 3 months. The reason why it took longer, I think, was down to firstly the regulatory side. There was a lot of regulatory hurdles in relation to the POP role that we had to jump through, and that is a process that we couldn't rush. But also there was a lot of education that we had to do with the platforms. We're talking about the first ever US IPO to be sold to UK retail. There was a lot of interaction that Sophia had to take place with the intermediaries to educate them around what they could and couldn't do. So it was a longer transaction than normal, but even so, 3 months feels like a very short period of time for a transaction of this kind of scale.
More broadly, what is the opportunity for retail investors if access to IPOs become more commonplace?
Well, we really hope that they will become more commonplace. And I think one of the takeaways from the SpaceX transaction is that including retail is a really, really valuable source of capital. Um, Going forwards, I think there are two opportunities here. The first is for other large global corporations to potentially include wider retail offers outside of their own jurisdictions, including UK retail offers, hopefully under the POP regime. But I think specifically the opportunity that we're looking at is really for the UK market. Obviously, we haven't seen a huge number of IPOs recently, but if the IPO market in the UK does pick up, it would be great if it becomes a matter of course for UK retail to be involved. We've seen that they can participate at scale, and I think the next step is to open that opportunity to wider offerings and wider IPOs.
Fantastic. And beyond IPOs, where else do you see retail participation expanding in capital markets?
There are lots of different ways. So wrap can be used for a variety of different sort of offerings. So we do a lot of secondary fundraisers. So companies that already exist that are raising additional capital are able to plug into retail via wrap, but also other types of products. So for example, fixed income, things like bonds. We've seen really great news earlier in the year in relation to some of the changes in the regulation. That means that lower denominated bonds are able to come into the market, and I think that's really important for retail. And wrap is certainly a distribution tool that can be used to support retail investors through their intermediaries also coming into those types of offerings. So I think there's lots of different things that wrap can do, and we're really excited to see where it goes in the future.
Fantastic. And how important is retail ownership in helping companies build long-term shareholder engagement and brand loyalty?
By and large, we are seeing that most retail investors are investing to hold for a period of time and actually top up further in the secondary market. So I think from that point of view, including a retail offer is very important because it allows you to grow that very sticky retail shareholder base and also improve liquidity in the secondary market.
Sounds like we've got exciting times ahead for us. So, how do you see the IPO landscape changing in the next 5 years?
Well, what's interesting at the moment is I think that what we are seeing and coming down the track seems to be a number of mega US IPOs. And that's really exciting. And hopefully, looking through the lens of the POP regime, that may be something that could be potentially brought to the UK market. But I think the wider backdrop is about how UK PLC can benefit from this. What we've seen over the last few years has been a real dearth of UK IPOs. And I think what would be great is if we can find our own version of SpaceX, a company that's going to IPO that will capture the imagination of UK, whether it's a large brand name or whether it's just an exciting prospect. I think that might be a catalyst for us seeing sort of retail engagement in UK companies similar to the levels that we've seen in sort of non-UK companies. So hopefully we are hearing sort of more rumored IPOs coming through in the UK market. Hopefully we'll see some of those come to fruition. And if there is an IPO boom in the UK and retail is involved, then I think that's going to be a great outcome for everyone.
And I think it's also great from an educational point of view as well. So some people that in the UK who are potentially very interested in investing but don't really know how are able to take part as we see more and more of these transactions come through into the UK market. We know that the intermediaries have done a huge amount of work in relation to providing more educational tools on their website around what is an IPO, how do you invest, and we've heard anecdotally from some of these platforms that they have seen a huge influx in people actually signing up for accounts with them in anticipation for these types of transactions. So, fingers crossed, it kind of shows that more and more retail investors are taking part, and we hope to see that in the future as more transactions come through.
So, do you think that SpaceX might encourage other technology IPOs to place greater emphasis on retail inclusion from day one?
Well, you would hope so. I think when the dust has settled, I think people will look at the SpaceX IPO as being a groundbreaking transaction in many ways. But I think the retail element will be an absolutely key part of it. And if you look across the market and you see there being 100 billion plus of demand, if you are now considering doing an IPO and considering the best way of raising capital and maximizing the capital raise, it feels to me that a retail offer, a global retail offer, a UK retail offer, it all makes sense.
So, could retail access become a competitive differentiator for issuers choosing to structure their listings?
Yes and no. I think it is a differentiator in the sense that there's a huge pool of capital, and we've seen the likes of SpaceX, just how significant that pool of capital can be that can come in, which is obviously very important for an issuer. But on the flip side, I don't think we should be framing retail inclusion as a differentiator because I think that that should just be commonplace and it should be standard. That for every kind of transaction, as long as it's appropriate for retail, retail should be involved. And fingers crossed, that's something that we will continue to see in the future.
So, what trends are you watching more closely across investing platforms and retail capital markets participation?
I think we are seeing more and more work being done in relation to communications with retail investors. So I think the platforms are doing a really great job of educating people who are interested in lots of different types of transactions of actually how to kind of take part and what it means. But also, it'll be really interesting to understand a little bit more about the types of investors that are coming through. So age, demographic, all of these sorts of things that I'm sure we'll see more and more of in due course. But fingers crossed, it sort of demonstrates that across the retail market, whether that be very small investors to very sort of large high net worth investors, that we are seeing participation across the board.
Now, looking towards the future, what's next for Winterflood and the Wrap platform?
Well, as Sophia said earlier, I think one of the key things from our perspective is demonstrating that we can operate at scale. I think that has now been demonstrated, and hopefully that will lead to more transactions coming through. Obviously, there's a huge interest in what happened in SpaceX, and fingers crossed that will lead to more deal flow going forwards. But I think one of the interesting things, and this comes back to the fact that SpaceX undertook a global retail offer, not just a UK retail offer, is the opportunity outside of UK. Obviously, Marex as a business has got 40 different offices around the world and has got a big European presence. And one of the things that we have heard is that there was no equivalent of a wrap ex-UK, so no central coordination. And I think that might create an opportunity for us to expand the wrap product outside of the UK, and it's something that we're actively exploring. Whether or not it will happen, we'll wait and see. But I think that could be an opportunity for us to take wrap and make it a little bit more international in its scope.
So, are there any innovations, new capabilities, or market developments you're particularly excited about in looking at the future of Wrap?
Wrap is it's kind of product agnostic. So you can put any kind of security through Wrap. Wrap is a distribution tool that we use to access the end retail investor via intermediaries. One of the big areas of opportunity for us is actually outside of the equity space, which is in the fixed income and debt space. We've already worked with the debt management office. We've done 20 different gilt transactions, and each transaction is now raising on average about 100 million from retail investors. So there is a huge opportunity set there. And then coming down the track, we have got corporate bonds. We don't know how large the demand will be, but it will be interesting. I think our view is that over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, we will start to see corporate bond issuers taking advantage of the new rules, coming to market, raising money from retail. And I think it will be really fascinating to see how retail respond to this opportunity they just haven't had for the last 20 years or so.
Brilliant. And finally, if you look ahead, what do you think retail participation in capital markets will look like compared with today?
I think there's big opportunity there, and I think what we will see is more and more investors taking part in these transactions. I think we're at kind of an inflection point now where there are many retail investors that would have taken part in a lot of transactions historically, and we've obviously seen the IPO market, for example, dry up slightly in the last few years. Hopefully, if there is a resurgence, we will see those investors come back in force, but also we will see a sort of new generation of retail investors come through as well. There are lots of different schemes happening across the country. So the government is obviously very involved in Savvy the Squirrel campaign and things like that. And so I think, based on all of these types of initiatives that are happening, we will start to see more and more investors come through, which is just great for the retail market and capital markets in the UK more generally. Is it Savvy the Squirrel? Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
So it's good, yeah.
And if there's one thing you'd like investors, issuers, or even advisors to understand about the future of retail inclusion, what would it be?
To me, I think it's around the opportunity. It's if you look, and let's just take the UK as an example. The UK has got one of the lowest levels of retail participation in equities across the whole of the G7. I think we've got less than 8% of UK individuals actually own equities. That's a huge opportunity set. When you compare it to the US, where the number's over 30%, we are talking about billions and billions of potential demand. So I think what we are seeing, and I think this is where SpaceX is a great example, is that when you give retail the opportunity to participate, when you give them an equal playing field with institutional investors, they will respond to that and they will respond in size. There's a long way to go. As Sophia said earlier, it's all about retail education. It's about getting people comfortable with making investments. And obviously, part of it is about having a good experience when you actually invest in an IPO, that you make money out of it. But looking forward, it feels to me that there is a huge untapped amount of potential demand out there for the UK. So that would be my message. Is it's around the opportunity, but.
And to build on that from a slightly different angle, I also think there's definitely something to raise here in relation to our role as an aggregator and how much work that takes away from the banks. So, Joe mentioned earlier as well, there isn't really an equivalent to us, as our understanding, in Europe and potentially other jurisdictions. And actually having an entity that can act as an aggregation point for a variety of different retail channels is very important and really helps simplify the process from their point of view as well. I think historically, retail has been seen as quite complex and tricky and time consuming. And fingers crossed, the role that we have and the work that we've been doing helps sort of demystify that.
So Winterflood was recently acquired by Marex. How do you think that's affected the transaction?
To be honest, it was a really interesting point in terms of executing this transaction, because the final integration of Winterflood into Marex took place on the 1st of June, and that actually straddled this entire transaction. So the transaction didn't go live until later in June. And I think one of my takeaways is how well Winterflood and Marex worked together. There are a number of people at Marex who hadn't really worked with us before, and they all hit the ground running. Worked incredibly hard to help us get this transaction over the line. But having that wider resource from Marex, coupled to a real kind of entrepreneurial spirit that we've seen at Marex, I think it really helped. And fingers crossed, it will help us going forwards as well, having that depth in terms of resource, ability, and experience.
And to build on that, I think working for an organization where you have significant funding and liquidity resources from a sort of cyber resilience point of view, there are so many areas here where being part of the Marex group has definitely been very helpful in relation to us being able to actually get our POP license and satisfy the requirements of the FCA within the timescales. So it's been very helpful for us to be part of Marex, certainly.
That's a wrap, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe and Sophia, for joining us today. We'll be back with you soon.